much hope that you have enjoyed the conversation to this point. I think you're absolutely, especially those of you that are in charge of environmental scanning, thinking about what's going on around you and your campus and your communities and your region. I think you're very much going to enjoy this next session. We, again, have been committed to think about how we can bridge the completion agenda to a broader public policy focus, thinking about our role in the economy, our role in the future of Georgia. Some of you have heard me say quite often that there probably is no other entity in all of state government, the assets of Georgia, that's more important in the next 50 to 100 years of the state of Georgia than the higher education system. We need to shout that from the rooftops every time that we get the chance, and we need to welcome the accountability and the scrutiny that comes along that, because the knowledge-based economy will be driven in many parts by what we do. Today we've got Dr. Patrick Kelly here with us. Patrick is not only a great colleague, but I consider a wonderful friend of mine in the higher education policy world. He is a senior associate with the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and we do a lot of talking about Complete College America and the National Governors Association, Complete to Compete, and all sorts of conversations about pipeline studies around the country. Patrick would not say it this way, but much of that research work and much of the data work that goes on in those national projects track right back to Patrick and his team at NCHEMS that do much of the research and the data analysis. Case in point, I saw Stan Jones stopping him out in the hallway. They're working on some things for CCA right now that CCA would absolutely not be able to make go were it not for NCHEMS involvement. Certainly an expert on the subject of higher education, economic, social indicators data, and it's wonderful to be able to have him here. What I hope to be able to do today is just scratch the surface and some of those things that we want to begin asking about the publics that we serve, the regions that we serve, the state that we serve. And then, if we like the conversations that we've had about about things from a regional context, perhaps we can take the next step to follow up to these conversations here in February and throughout the coming year. That's another place where we can stretch Complete College Georgia to continue some sub-region activities and continue the conversations in some of the institutional and regional profiles that we can do through Patrick. Patrick, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Mic's on? Okay. Thank you, Houston. I'm very glad to be here. I know this is the session right before lunch, so I'll try to be tight. We see a lot of national statistics like this. An adult with a bachelor's degree earns $1 million more than an adult with a high school diploma over a lifetime. We see a lot of national statistics like this from the College Board, from the National Center for Education Statistics. The reality is that picture is very different depending on where you live. It's probably $2 million in Connecticut, $300,000 in North Dakota. Georgia, just above the U.S. average here. These are the difference in annual earnings between a bachelor's degree holder and a high school diploma. If we look at this picture, we see the earnings at the high school level, which are the blue diamonds, the associate's degree level, the red, bachelor's degree, green. Just how different states are from one another. The largest gap in Connecticut, the smallest in Montana, and a few states where an associate's degree gets you almost as much as a bachelor's degree in the employment market. To drive this point even further, if every state produced an additional 100 certificates, 100 associate's degrees, 100 bachelor's degrees, what would the additional personal earnings be, which is the vertical axis? And what would the state revenues generated be, which is the horizontal axis? And state revenues, this is sales tax, property tax, income tax, savings, and Medicaid. And we quickly see how different states are. This chart also may reveal your politics. I'm not promoting tax increases, but if you believe in small government, you want to be in the top left quadrant. Rick Perry is probably happy where he is. Texas. High personal gains, low state gains. If you believe in large government or the effectiveness of government, you want to be in the top right quadrant. High earnings, high state revenues generated. I don't think any state wants to be where Maine is, in the bottom right. Low personal gain, high state gain. Consequently, we've done a model for return on investment. It's out on the NCHEMS website. Nevada has such low taxes that it never recovers its state investment in higher education. Fortunately, I haven't gone to Nevada to tell them that. Point is, place matters. And it matters within Georgia as well as Georgia's position relative to other states. And I'm going to go through probably more maps than you can digest today, but nonetheless to try to tell a story about the state of Georgia and its regional differences, with a focus primarily on the link between education, workforce development, and economic development, what we call the emerging policy triangle. The conversation about higher education, I'm sure it's happening in Georgia, is increasingly being linked to the conversations about economic and workforce development. In fact, NCHEMS has worked in virtually every state in the U.S. at some point. We find it very difficult to have meaningful conversations with legislators about higher education without going through the door of economic or workforce development. And I'm sure these linkages have been discussed throughout your conference. So to the nation and the 50 states, these are the median annual earnings for some college and associate's degree by county. The stars are the locations of your institutions. The blue are the highest earnings, the light blue the lowest. When putting these maps together, has it occurred to you, now that we all don't ride horses, or some of us may, that you have too many counties? I lived in Kentucky for 12 years, and we had 120 counties. You have 158, I think. Only Texas has more. Anyway, it makes for a nice, colorful map, right? The median earnings for bachelor's degree and higher, the Atlanta area. Down south, I guess, Macon, Columbus, Savannah. The difference in earnings between some college or an associate's degree and a high school diploma. So what, sort of back to the U.S. picture, I mean, which areas in the state of Georgia have higher earnings for associate degree holders relative to high school and for a bachelor's degree and higher? Frankly, there are areas of the state where the gap between college degree holders and high school diploma holders in earnings are much higher than others, as you might imagine. It's typically in urban areas. Educational attainment, percent of adults 18 to 24 with a high school diploma but no college. These are students that, or residents that stopped out after high school, never entered college, but are still college age. You can see areas of the state here where the most or highest proportions of these young adults are with a high school diploma but no college. Typically in rural areas. The same for older adults. This picture is fascinating to me in that it almost exactly mirrors the locations of institutions. Where there aren't institutions, you have high proportions of adults that stopped out after high school, did not attend college. I wasn't able to be at most of your conference until the last session, but Houston informed me that one of the conversation threads throughout all of your work is how do you get adults with college credit back into college to earn degrees? These are the areas of the state in which the highest proportions of those adults are. Those that stopped out halfway through college or 3/4 through college, but don't actually have a college degree. Percent of adults with an associate's degree are higher. So these are the highest educated adults in and around Atlanta. Again, Columbus, Macon, Savannah. Again, the poorest educated parts of the state tend to be in areas that are not near institutions. Percent of underrepresented minority population without a college degree. These are African American, Hispanic, Native American. I wasn't able to disaggregate for each of those populations given the sample size of the data set, but again, highest educated minorities in and around Atlanta and in other urban centers, and the lowest in other parts of the state. The difference between whites and this underrepresented minority population, there's a county in which whites are 47.1% higher in college attainment than the underrepresented minority population. So as you think about your region and where your institution's located, what are the racial ethnic gaps between whites and minorities, and particularly in areas where minority populations are growing rapidly, certainly in the urban areas. To make a point, I asked Houston and his staff to send me data on enrollment patterns. And by that, it's first-time enrollment of Georgia residents, not out-of-state students. We like to do this at NCHEMS to make a point. Most of your colleges are a lot more local than you like to think they are, even the research institutions. Some are less local. Abraham Baldwin gets 80% of its first-time Georgia resident enrollment from these counties. So it reaches into a large part of the state to get its enrollment. Albany State gets 80% of its enrollment cumulatively from these counties. Close by, Atlanta, Savannah. Armstrong, in and around the institution, and predominantly Atlanta. Metropolitan State, very, very local. Augusta State. In Augusta and part of Atlanta. Bainbridge College, very local. Clayton State. Coastal Georgia, near home, and Atlanta. Columbus State. Dalton State. Darton State, a little broader reach around home, and again, Atlanta. East Georgia. Fort Valley. Georgia College and State University, mostly Atlanta. Gwinnett, very close to home. Consequently, you have a lot of the colleges too. Georgia Southwestern.
I did not ask that to say.
Georgia Highlands. This may surprise you. Now, we know Georgia Tech gets a lot of out-of-state students, but from within Georgia, it's a lot more local than you would imagine. Perimeter College, Georgia Southern. A lot of the more rural colleges have to dip into Atlanta just because there's not enough population around the institution. Georgia State, Gainesville, Gordon State, Kennesaw State, Macon, Middle Georgia, North Georgia, Savannah, from Savannah and from Atlanta and a few other counties. Southern, Georgia State, or South Georgia State, UGA. Again, more local than you might realize. West Georgia, Valdosta. Waycross. Your entire system of institutions. It's really where your population centers are. To pause. These patterns are why regional efforts matter. You serve students from particular places. You have particular high schools that are major feeders to your institution. In some of your cases, relatively few. It's not difficult to establish these pathway relationships with the key feeders of your institution. Workforce. Percent of the civilian employed population employed in high-end management, business, financial occupations. Again, in and around Atlanta, Savannah, the major population centers. Very little of this employment in rural areas. Percent employed in STEM-type occupations. Much of the rural part of the state has high proportions of education occupations. In fact, the same for health. It's not uncommon in any rural part of America that the predominant occupations for college graduates, anyway, are in healthcare and education. Sales and office, these are mid-level, typically college-educated workers. Production and transportation, and low-skilled service occupations. One of the phenomenons that we all pay attention to in higher education is the migration patterns of college-educated residents. Georgia has benefited mightily from importing talent, particularly into Atlanta. You draw from the entire southeast region and even across the country. There are states that, in in turn, lose a lot of graduates to you. I live in Colorado. We're a master at importation. And Georgia is too. If you look at this by state or by region, though, it's only happening in two areas, at least in the last 5 years. There's a net importation of college-educated residents in and around Atlanta and south between Macon and Columbus. You can see the west or east part of Georgia is losing college-educated residents. And finally, a lot of adults in Georgia, like many southern states, are in areas struggling to earn a living wage. How do we retrain, retool, prepare them for different and better jobs? And it's, if we look at the state of Georgia, the percent of the population, 18 to 64, with some college or less, some college, no degree or less, living in families earning less than a living wage, and by that I mean 200% of poverty. It's typically around $20,000 for a family of 3. We see the areas of the state that have very high proportions of these adults, upwards of nearly half of the entire 18 to 64-year-old adult population. How do you as institutions serve these adults in ways they haven't been served before? Again, preparing them for jobs that pay more than a living wage. Many of these adults aren't going to lockstep through a traditional bachelor's program. And this is simply the sheer numbers of these adults. And again, despite the percentage being fairly low in and around Atlanta, Atlanta is so highly populated that it still contains the vast majority of these adults, in addition to a lot of the rural areas. Houston and I and Brian Nolan, now president of East Tennessee, it was mainly Houston and Brian that created this index, but I helped out at some point. It's essentially comprised of 3 categories: education factors, percent of adults with a high school diploma, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and then again the difference between young and older adults. Which areas of the state are young adults less educated than old adults? And we see that particularly at the state level in about half the states in the U.S. Where adults are actually, older adults are more educated than the next generation. There are economic factors, the unemployment rate, percent in poverty, family and personal income, and then percent manufacturing and extraction employment. These are sectors of the economy that are in decline in most parts of America. These are the folks that are being laid off, having to retrain, retool, put pressure on the post-secondary system. And finally, population growth, the young population relative to the old. What areas of the state are growing rapidly and have high percentages of underrepresented minority students. For Georgia, on the education factors, combined, the red areas are the areas of the state that have the highest need, the green the lowest. This pattern pretty much mirrors the educational attainment map that I showed earlier. The economic factors, no surprise. If you look at the cluster on the right, eastern part of the state, that's the part of the state, again, that's losing a lot of its college graduates to either Atlanta or to other states. And we certainly see the economically depressed area in the southwest part of the state. The market factors, these are areas that have high proportions of young adults relative to older adults, the population's growing, and or high percentages of minorities. And when you combine all three to create the overall index, these are the areas of the state that have the highest educational need. They're the areas of the state that have low attainment, poor economic conditions, and either high growth population-wise or high percentages of minorities or high percentages of low-income residents. My presentation is not an hour, 35 minutes, and maybe we can entertain questions. I think, if you didn't have, if you only had 5 institutions instead of, how many, 31? 31. I probably would have put a profile together that walked through these data for the region that you serve, the educational attainment relative to the state average, the percent minority, income. I couldn't do that for 31 institutions. The point is, how do you regionally, where you sit, who you serve, where your institution is located, more creatively and effectively connect your efforts in education to workforce and economic development. And I'm sure it varies tremendously from institution to institution, how engaged you are with local employers in your region, etc. It's a concept that essentially has been called stewardship of place. And several states have focused heavily on this. And how do you more effectively use data like these? These are all publicly available, mostly from the Census Bureau, to make the case more clearly about this connection. And I will stop there. And if there are any questions about not only this, but about some of the work we've done in other states around these areas. Yeah.
We're going to make the PowerPoint available to everybody. We're going to post it out on the CCG website. And we'll also, I guess the attendees list, we'll make sure to send it out today.
This is a super specific question, but in your model, it looked like all the elements in the model were based on 2010 census data except for the unemployment rate. And I didn't know if that was a typo or if there was really a reason why you were using an older unemployment rate.
It's a typo. It's all 2010 data. Sorry about that.
Wow. Your data is mind-boggling, the way you have presented it, though it is available. To me, it looks like, do you think that even the USG need to be broken into 4 parts based on your statistics so that we all can be very efficient, including the USG?
Was that broken into 4 parts, the state?
Based on the earlier chart that you showed for the states, can we divide the state into those 4 areas that you had, different states falling into different categories of income and
Yeah. Yeah.
It's glitching in my mind looking at these. So I don't let me throw this food for thought.
Yeah, and I could break it out any way you wanted. Yeah. I mean, the reality is Georgia, like a lot of states, is really not a single state. You have very clear regions, with very different economic conditions, population conditions. You're more aware of this than me. You have a better sense, actually, of these maps and what stories they tell than I do. I grew up in Birmingham and have spent quite a bit of time in Georgia. But any other questions?
Diversity of what you showed among 31 and now institutions and the patterns of where they draw their students from and the diverse needs of the state. And given the fact that you've only shown half of the higher educational effort in the state because the technical college system is not mapped up there.
Right.
How do we take a step toward a comprehensive statewide policy on post-secondary education? I mean, I can't, it's awful difficult to come up with a plan. I think this goes back to this gentleman's question. How do you have a system plan when you have this much diversity in institution and need? That's a real challenge. You got any suggestions?
Well, let me say this. I think we've whet the appetite. Thank you, Dr. Noble. One of the things that you're exactly correct about, Mr. President, is that we've got to start breaking down the many Georgias within Georgia. And as we're talking about things as broad as complete college Georgia, there's no way to do that in as if a couple of levers that we push and pull are going to affect things uniformly throughout the state. Patrick mentioned the stewardship of place concept. Some of you that are from ASCU institutions in particular, American Association of State Colleges and Universities, may be familiar with stewardship of place, making place matter. That concept is really on breaking down your region as it's defined. Some of you, forget the maps you just saw, you may define yourself as tightly clustered counties or a broad 15, 20, 25 plus county area. But either way, looking at what is it in terms of the assets that you have from a research, teaching, and service standpoint, what are the most pressing needs of the region that you serve? And those can be educational as much as they can be quality of life. It can be water issues. It can be all sorts of things. But with the stewardship of place concept is thinking about how research, teaching, and service assets of the higher education enterprise, whether that be the university system or the technical college system or our private college peers or proprietary peers. It's thinking very broadly about everything that's in your backyard, what can be mobilized to meet those human capital, economic development, social, cultural development sort of needs. Patrick mentioned the ability to be able to drive down. One thing that NCHEMS has certainly done are regional profiles that are much more complex than anything that he's shown you here, to where you can really scrape below that surface 2 or 3 levels and really start painting a picture of your region, sub-region of the state, instead of trying to do that in a vacuum as if it's affected. One of the things I've learned in coming to Georgia is how quickly Atlanta gobbles up the attention of the data, all right, in broad data sets. Atlanta dominates. There's nothing like Atlanta and Tennessee and Oklahoma in those data sets for those 2 states. And that's one of the things I think that as we get into that, you've almost got to take apart 6 or 7 subregions outside of Atlanta. You've almost got to turn Atlanta into about 4 subregions in and of itself. We've got some desire to do some of that deep dive. We have the desire to perhaps develop some toolkits, some sub-region profiles that you can use in your conversations, whether they be about Complete College Georgia or in broader conversations. I don't know, some of you may be interested in looking at some of the stewardship of place type of concepts. We'd like to be able to feed the monster, that monster being your interest in having good information to be able to operationalize by maybe looking to see if we get get Patrick to scrape at least 1 or 2 more layers down. But we can do it if we want to do it. But I hope to be able to get the sense of this group and some other settings in the next couple of weeks to see if that's something that we need to pursue.
So this, this is sort of a chicken and an egg question. When you were going through the maps of where most institutions draw 80% of their students, it seemed to me that virtually all of our institutions that have residence for students, in other words, the regional universities, the state universities, places where you can live on campus, draw a lot of their students from Metro Atlanta. As Houston said, Atlanta gobbles up everything. And so I'm wondering about the tension between trying to come up with plans that serve your local region while knowing that half of your students come from Metro Atlanta. So if you really focus on the stewardship of the place where you are and its needs, you may or may not still be creating an environment that works for the vast majority of the available student population in the state. And I think that's a tension I think that there's sort of out of Metro Atlanta institutions have to grapple with. And yeah. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how somebody goes about doing that.
Well, I look to Houston when I say this. I think you have to acknowledge that tension, but also improve your focus on local issues. I understand a lot of these institutions are in rural areas that, at least directly out of high school pipeline, would never feed the college to the point of full capacity enrollment. I don't think there's intentionality in saying at all that you still don't need to focus on Atlanta anymore. It's just that you have demographic conditions and economic conditions around the institution that makes the institution unique. And in some ways it's those adults that, again, stopped out of college or struggling to earn a living wage. How do you and the institutions around you better serve those adults? So I don't think it's an either or. I mean, it's just fairly common in any state with a large metro area. You see the same patterns.
On the new mic runner.
I mean, just the other thing that surprises me about Atlanta is how reliant its population has grown so fast, how reliant it is on for-profit education. When I look at the data nationally, Atlanta is one of the largest markets in the entire U.S. for for-profit online education. And it's simply the fact that the population has outpaced the capacity of brick and mortar institutions to serve it. So that was, again, sort of eye-opening to me over the last few years.
One of the other tensions I think that exists, and particularly it affects resource allocation within an institution, is not shown in the data, but I'm sure you have it, is the percentage of students that come from out of Georgia and then serving that population versus serving the in-state population. That for some institutions that may be as large a tension as the difference between Metro Atlanta and their local area in terms of how you allocate resources to serve that local area while at the same time you're serving these other populations of students.
Right, and it's an important revenue source, out-of-state tuition. Frankly, some of the institutions have a lot more capacity to do that than others. And you very well know that. Somebody in the far back.
Looking at this data, I know in our own institution we found retention has a ring around us. We retain better those students who come from the area. And we retain not as well students the further away they get, for example, Atlanta. Has there been any overlay of that to look at the system in terms of how that lines up with our retention efforts?
I haven't done it, but I'm sure.
Susan, the question was about retention rates by county of origin. Do you know if we've done any analysis of that in the past?
We have taken a look at it, but it's been a long time. We can get that. Yeah. I mean, of course, again, it's still dependent on the information of the first time freshmen, whatever your is, all first time freshmen or second time freshmen. But yeah, we can take a look at it by county.
Is that, just out of curiosity, is that true for out-of-state students as well?
I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think it might say something about what we can do as a system. You know, we're always looking to grow our population going elsewhere, but we might do better to serve the people around us, and that might be something the system wants to look at.
Yep.
I gave a presentation at our church last night, and I made the comment, there's no such thing as a silly question. I'm going to count on that today. I was following along the model that you developed here. Can you tell us what your intended definition is of the Educational Needs Index? What are you really trying to say with this set of, with this pictorial?
Essentially, I'll try to answer that, and Houston might have to. He's the original brainchild of this. Essentially, just educational attainment, when we talk about the pressures that colleges face, is not enough of the picture. And essentially, the index was designed to bring together, you know, not only poorly educated areas, but areas that their economic conditions are poor, or there's certain industries that are in decline that employed a large percentage of their workforce. And then finally, the pressures that population growth and underrepresented minorities bring to that as well. So it was really just to bring together the variables that we thought were the most important when you think about educational need. And of course, you know, the three factors separately are combined on this last map. And we did this for the whole U.S. And if you do the U.S. picture by county, by quartile, four separate colors, equal sized groups, you'll see a lot of red in the southeast, period. The southeast and the southwest. Essentially undereducated, growing, and relying on certain economies that are in decline. And you see that in the South, you see it in the Southwest. In the Southwest, it's driven by the difference in attainment between whites and minorities. Colorado has the highest gap between whites and minorities in educational attainment of any state in the country. Almost 60% of whites have college degrees, only 20% or 15% of minorities. So it's these factors that we're trying to bring to the table here.
One quick question. What would your map look like if you had, instead of percentages, if you had used shared numbers?
The only one I did like that was this one. In fact, it's important to look at both. And rural areas, while undereducated, still have relatively small numbers. That's not to say you should ignore it, but you need to look at both. I just thought that if I went through 30 more maps, that your eyes would glaze over and you'd fall asleep. So, but certainly if we go down this next path, as Houston mentioned, to put together more detailed data for regions in Georgia, we can include numbers as well as percentages.
One good last question, I think. Aside from the need to have more counties and more institutions, which is my takeaway from your presentation, I was wondering what other sort of, as you're preparing this, what other odd facts or connections or disconnections popped out in your mind as you're surveying all of this different information? You mentioned the for-profit. That's an interesting connection, and I wonder if there were others.
Well, I think it's been touched on. It's rare to me, even in a state like Colorado with Denver in the Front Range, how much Atlanta dominates the demographics in Georgia. But also how very different Georgia is regionally. It's no surprise to me to see the red on the bottom left, because having grown up in Alabama, that stretches right on into Alabama. Don't need a state border. It's the same demographic conditions, the same economic conditions. And I think if I had shown you the U.S. map for the needs index, you would really see these patterns starkly across the country. But no, I was familiar enough with Georgia that I can't think of any more great surprises. But I'm certain if I continue to put data together, and the charts or the maps that showed the service, really the enrollment patterns, I don't want to call them service areas, that might be a loaded term, surprised me for some institutions. Normally, when I show those in other states, invariably almost every institution is a tight cluster right around itself. And a lot of institutions feel like they're international or statewide. Or the reality is they're very local. There were a handful, Valdosta, some others, that were really drawing from all over the state. And I wouldn't say that's surprising, but it was a find. I wanted to drive that point home, and I wasn't able to do it quite as strongly as I wanted to.
Well, let's take a moment to thank Patrick for taking the time. Like I said, we'll be following up, and we'll be talking with several of our major advisory groups about the potential for doing a little more deep dive into some of these type of data sets if they're of value to you, and certainly we can see how some things like this are of value to our system level work. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Noble, who will let us know what the next steps are.
Before you leave, just a word. I know you all are getting a little tired, so take a deep breath, because what you're about to do is very important to us. When you leave here, if you will go to the atrium and pick up a boxed lunch and return to the working breakout room groups that you had yesterday. The purpose of the working lunch today is to reflect and solidify the discussion from yesterday for the use of reporting out during our 2 o'clock session. And this is a very important part because these will be our takeaways for your regional needs. So I encourage you to participate, grab your lunch, go straight to your breakout rooms, and then we'll see you back in here at 2 o'clock.